"73 years ago, on the 17th of September 1948, an aspiring young British racing driver celebrated his 19th birthday. The following day, on the 18th of September, 73 years ago to the day today, the Goodwood Motor Circuit opened its doors for the very first time, and Stirling Crawford Moss entered his first serious motor race right here. Driving a 500cc Cooper Jap, which his hard-nosed father, Alfred, had made him largely pay for himself, Stirling didn't just win his very first race, he absolutely overwhelmed and crushed the opposition. In a 3-lap race lasting just over 6 minutes, he won by 30 seconds. Here was the shape of things to come and the birth of a sporting legend. Over the course of the following 14 seasons, Stirling would compete in a further 62 races at Goodwood, winning 22 times in total and taking 12 podiums. In between times, he travelled the world, racing anything and everything, wherever and whenever there was a decent race to run, a decent challenge to face. He became not just one of the most gifted, gracious and greatest racing drivers of all time, he became world famous as simply Mr. Motor Racing. And when back home from his travels, he returned repeatedly to race right here at Goodwood. It wasn't just the number of appearances or victories or the fact that his first and last races both took place right here. He seemed to have a natural affinity for this place. And if he loved Goodwood, then in equal measure, Goodwood certainly loved him. Some regard Stirling Moss as the greatest racing driver of all time. Others, the greatest never to win the Formula One World Championship, or even the greatest all-rounder. To us, he was and always will be simply Mr. Goodwood. Competing in an era so dangerous that any career lasting more than 7 or 8 years was regarded as pushing your luck, Stirling actually raced for 14 years. During that time, when there might only have been 8 Grand Prix run each season, he won 16 times from 66 starts. He was runner-up in the World Championship 4 times. He only lost the 1958 World Championship by a single point, and that was one he had played a post-race role in saving for his rival Mike Hawthorne by pleading on Mike's behalf against disqualification. When asked decades later would he have done that if he'd known it would cost him the title, his reply was simple: yes, of course. Well, why would that be so? Because it was the right thing to do. Stirling was indeed the epitome of British sportsmanship. And just how good was he in any kind of car? He put in perhaps the most stupendous single-day sporting performance ever to win, the 1955 1,000-mile Mille Miglia, in a record-shattering time of 10 hours, 7 minutes, 48 seconds. Attempt that without a rest today, and you'd be arrested. His drive secured sports car world championship titles for both Mercedes-Benz and Aston Martin. He won 7 Tourist Trophy races, 4 of them right here at Goodwood. He was one of only 3 drivers ever to win a Coupe d'Or for 3 consecutive penalty-free runs in the Alpine Rally. He finished 2nd overall in the snowbound Monte Carlo in a humble Sunbeam Talbot. But bald facts don't tell the full story. From the moment that 5-time world champion Fangio returned in 1958 until his career-ending accident here at Goodwood in 1962, Stirling's talents towered head and shoulders above the rest. He was the standard by which every racing driver was judged and by which they judged themselves. Just consider again the facts of that 55 millimilia drive. 992 miles on public roads around Italy, through towns and villages, up city streets, over mountain passes, to average 97.96 miles an hour. In second place, in an identical car, but without the weight of a co-driver, was Fangio himself, 32 minutes behind. Stirling and his utterly fearless navigator Dennis Jenkinson of Motorsport magazine beat the previous record by half an hour. Although arguably the standout achievement of Stirling's career, that was far from his only superhuman drive. He had God-given talent to match the very greatest natural drivers, and combined it with a fierce professionalism and a will to win, which made him almost unbeatable. During those 4 seasons from 1958 to 61, if he didn't win, it was generally because the car had simply let him down. And it all, of course, came to an end far too soon against the bank here at St Mary's on Easter Monday, 1962. He was only 32, and as a driver was in his absolute pomp. He had bounced back from injuries before and expected to do just the same again, but this time it was different. When he first tested his post-crash abilities, fittingly here at Goodwood in a Lotus 19, he identified a deficit. No longer could he simultaneously corner his car, scan his instruments and mirrors, assess the situation, and wave to a friend or to a pretty girl he'd spotted in the crowd. His special instinctive advantage, his preternatural skills, had been diminished, so he opted to retire rather than be less than the absolute best. This Stirling would later regret. I tried too soon, he'd say. I should have waited another 2 or 3 years to recover, but I would still have been young enough. But unlike other retired drivers, he never disappeared from public consciousness. Just as he was the only true professional racing driver, so he transformed himself into the first professional retired racing driver. In fact, his profile in retirement seemed, if anything, even higher than it had been when he was at the very pinnacle of his chosen sport. Team management, product endorsement, media roles, appearances in TV and film, the voice of Rory the racing car. So loved was he by fans around the world that he enjoyed a hugely successful career for nearly 60 years, just in being Stirling Moss. For decades after his retirement, if you were pulled over by a policeman, chances are they would utter the immortal line, "And who do you think you are? Stirling Moss?" And it happened to Stirling himself more than once. When the Festival of Speed began in 1993, followed by this revival in 1998, Stirling and Susie became a regular fixture at Goodwood once more. He was patron of the festival and an ever-present superstar at revival, always supported, of course, by his amazing wife, Susie. I'm proud to have known them both as very dear friends, and I'm delighted to say that the wonderful Susie, of course, is with us here today, along with Stirling's children, Elliot and Alison. Also joining us on the grid are Jim and Annie Strudwick, the St John's ambulance workers who attended Stirling after his crash in 1962. Along with many great champions of past, present and future, the members of the Goodwood Supporters Association who played such an important role in keeping Goodwood going during the pandemic. All are here to pay respects to the ultimate hero of the Goodwood motor circuit over so very, very many years. It became a tradition for all of us to celebrate his birthday right here at Goodwood every year. And in recent times, his 70th, 80th and 90th birthdays were all marked at the revival. Now we gather for a rather different occasion to celebrate a life lived to the absolute maximum, epitomizing his motto, "Motion is tranquility." as the great man would always say, "Ciao, Stirling. We miss you more than we can possibly say."
Stirling, I admire with everything I have.
Another Mercedes in the German team with English ace Stirling Moss at the wheel.
Stirling Moss, wow. The era where they drove was nothing compared to now, you know. They were gladiators at that time. You go in the car, you don't know if you're going to come back alive.
And here comes Moss, well out in front with the leaders. Just over 10 hours later, it's Moss who crosses the line to win in record time. Fangio comes second and Malioli third, making Moss the first British driver ever to win this famous race.
In the third lap came a great moment for the record crowd as Moss, number 12, forged past his teammate. And except for a brief period, Stirling Moss stayed just ahead of the world champion to win by 1/5 of a second at an average speed of 86.47 miles per hour. Moss sportingly gave the credit to Fangio, who, had he said, allowed him to realise his ambition of being the first home driver to win the British Grand Prix.
His aura, the way he carried himself, his confidence, he was never shy in telling you what he thought or which way up he felt things should be. So he just carried that "I am Stirling Moss," you know, and when everybody else wishes they were Stirling Moss.
Stirling Moss, number 18, leads Berra, number 4, and Hawthorne, number 10, in the first lap, and holds his lead for the first quarter of the race, driving as brilliantly as ever. Suddenly, misfortune. Moss's car's giving trouble, and he takes over Van Wall, number 20, from teammate Tony Brooks. His two chief opponents out of the way, Moss leaves the field behind and wins. The crowd's mad with delight, for it's the first time in 34 years that a British car's won a major Grand Prix.
In his day, Stirling Moss's title, given to him by the daily papers, the tabloids, was Mr. Motor Racing. And I think that describes him quite extraordinarily well, because in his day, he was the best racing driver in the world.
Reg Parnell was Aston Martin team manager. Ace driver of that team, the great Stirling Moss. Having driven the fastest practice lap, Stirling's car was first on the lineup for the Le Mans start. After 4 hours, not only was Stirling Moss the winner, but two other Aston Martins were second and third.
The whole world is proud of him. Absolutely down-to-earth guy, but one of the toughest ever out there.
Stirling Moss leads them all, and they just can't catch him. In a race of 1,000 bends, Stirling holds his own to flash over the line 3 seconds ahead of the Ferrari pack. A great win in a British car and a flying start for the world title.
He's been a great man, and he's been a great ambassador for Great Britain and sport in general. By far the greatest model as a race driver to look up to. He dressed well, he walked well, he looked like a racing driver, he behaved like a racing driver, he drove like a racing driver.
Sir Jackie Stewart, some people leave an indelible mark on the world, and Sir Stirling Moss was one such, wasn't he?
I don't think there's anyone in motorsport that has been more important to the world in getting the world recognised in motorsport as Stirling Moss. He was the absolute perfect racing driver. He looked like a racing driver should look like. He talked like a racing driver should talk. And he drove like a racing driver had to drive. He was an amazing man. I've got his autograph here at Goodwood. All these years ago, I think I was 14 at the time. And he was my hero, one of the greatest drivers that we've ever had. And he carried the sport in such style. And of course, he did look after pretty nice-looking ladies from time to time. So that fitted with motor racing very well. No, Stirling Moss, there's never been anything like it, and there never will be.
How will you remember him?
The way he behaved, the way he drove, he was smooth. I learned a lot from him. He didn't harass a car. He was gentle with a car. I mean, the fact that this car here did the full 1,000 kilometres, not a mark hardly on it, that was the type of driver Stirling Moss was. And just an example to everyone, I think. He was just terrific. He was good with, I'll never forget him when he was quite young, smoking cigarettes as he drove down with the car after he had won the race. I mean, everything was just done so well. I just think that we're very lucky in Britain to have had somebody called Stirling Moss.
Sir Jackie Stewart, thank you very much.
Wise words from Jackie Stewart, from His Grace Duke of Richmond, and everybody shares their thoughts and feelings about Stirling. He was the consummate professional, not only when he was racing, but when he was, after he retired. If there was a speaking engagement, he did his research. He always turned up on time. I spoke to him a number of times at the Festival Speed and at Revival. He gave time. He was always polite and friendly, answered my questions. I once said to him, Stirling, C-Type Jaguar, D-Type Jaguar, Aston Martin DB3S, Aston Martin DBR1, Mercedes 300 SLR. If you had the choice of jumping into those cars to drive around Goodwood, which one would you choose? In an instant, he said, 300 SLR, no question about it. He really loved racing for the Mercedes team. When he tested the W196, the Grand Prix car, before the season started in 1955, he was really impressed by the fact that when he pulled into the pits with the Mercedes, there waiting for him was a Mercedes mechanic with a bowl of water and a cloth to wipe his hands and his face with. He appreciated that sort of professionalism. And we've all got our favorite Stirling Moss stories, of which there are so many. Martin Haven joins me. He'll have memories of Stirling. Martin, in particular.
Well, my memories of Stirling are of him in his historic racing era when he came back. Obviously, he started racing again in the British Touring Car Championship in Audi 80s. That was Martin Brundle's first initiation into touring cars as well. But he's been, every time I've been to Goodwood, whether for the Festival of Speed, for Revival, the members meeting, he's been omnipresent. And he was here from day one of the circuit. And it's an astonishing, given how many cars he raced in how many places, his association with the circuit is as strong as with anything anywhere. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we now need to clear the grid if we can. I know you would all love some photos of the 722 Mercedes and of Lady Susie, but we do need to clear the grid, please, to try and get this parade underway. Mercedes will lead and everyone else will follow their way round on another picture-perfect Goodwood day. And if there is a time and a place to remember Sir Stirling Moss, then this would have to be the time, the place and the weather in which to do it. So, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you on the grid who are not in the cars, please, if you could just make some room for us to get the parade underway. And you will have ample opportunity to see the cars from trackside, from the grandstands. And a chance to remember one of sport's all-time greats. He transcends being a racing driver, transcended being a British racing driver. Stirling Moss, like Pelé, became a household name because of his sporting achievements, but also because of his entire life thereafter. And certainly very much a touchstone for everything, I think, that happens here at the Goodwood Motor Circuit.
And we remember that Stirling didn't just drive the 300 SLR around the Mille Miglia, he raced it in the Targa Florio, and he raced it in the TT at Dundrod, and it finished both those races looking much less immaculate than it does now. In fact, at Dundrod, it threw a tyre tread and wiped out the bodywork over the rear tyre. It looked very bruised and battered. In the Targa Florio, he hit a wall at one stage, and it's I think it's appropriate that the Mercedes is beautifully restored and in an absolutely brand new condition. There's the Cooper 500, the great Cooper, which he raced with Jap engine, with Norton engines, and indeed he raced it in Grand Prix. He raced it in the Brussels Grand Prix with the 1100 B-twin Jap with extra fuel tank strapped onto the side. It wasn't very comfortable, but he astonished everybody with his speed in that little car. Damon in the Lotus 18, with which Stirling won the Monaco Grand Prix in 60 and 61, but also he won the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring against the might of the opposition in the little Lotus 18, and he described that as his greatest race ever.
Of course, Stirling Moss, known as Mr Motor Racing, Graham Hill, known as Mr Monaco, and then there's the link between that Rob Walker Lotus 18, with which he won at Monaco on that scorching hot Côte d'Azur day, with the side panels removed, and Graham Hill was, as I think every British racing driver has been since Stirling ascended the stage, the international stage, a huge fan of Sir Stirling Moss. No matter whether you raced against him and lost to him, or on occasion passed his stranded car at the side of the track, or whether you grew up like Derek Bell with him as the headline name. And Sir Stirling was so keen to race British-built cars, to race for British teams, to have Great Britain back at the forefront of international motor racing. In a lot of ways, if he'd been a little less determined to drive British, he might well have had an entirely different career. But then, you know, but for one tiny twist of fate, we've all had a different life. So.
But it was great that after 55 in Mercedes, 56 in the Maserati Works team, 57 brought the Van Wall, and to almost win the championship in 58 in the Van Wall was a great achievement. He didn't like it all that much. It was quick, and that was the most important thing. But he said the 250F was probably a much nicer car to drive than the Van Wall, but it didn't matter. The thing was, the Van Wall was quick.
Yeah, the 250F he always admired for its poise and its balance, its forgiving nature, just a driver's car, not one that was ever going to turn around and bite you without warning. If you trusted it, it would reward that trust.
We've just seen the four-wheel drive Ferguson. He drove it in the wet at Alton Park, and he really delighted in that because he had the unfair advantage of four-wheel drive and, of course, won the race.
And that car will be racing here this weekend at Goodwood in this revival meeting. And
the little 328 BMW, which belonged to his mum, which really was the first competition car that Stirling drove. He didn't race it, but he drove it in rallies, trials, and driving tests, and that gave him the taste for it. And also, I guess his parents realized that here was a boy with real skill.
Well, both the children, both the Moss children, Stirling and Pat, were keen horse riders. They were always very sporty right from early days, and it was not necessarily guaranteed that either of them would end up in motorsport. They could easily have been leading lights in the equestrian world. What a different world that would have been for us motor racing fans had Stirling not been allowed to borrow his mother's car to do auto tests, and had not done that and had remained in the equestrian world. You know, he might have ended up with Olympic medals and Olympic titles, instead of which he is a household name across the globe for his racing prowess.
He had a great sense of humor. He was involved with a team of drivers. When you see the bronze hardtop Jaguar XK120, that was taking place in a 24-hour test at Montlhéry to see if how far they could drive that car for 24 hours. and it was pretty boring going round and round the banking in Montlhéry, day and night. And in the middle of the night, when I think Bert Hadley was driving the car, Stirling and one of the other drivers went out on the track. Stirling on the shoulders of the other driver, both of them draped in a great long tarpaulin, and on his head Stirling had a megaphone oil filler, and poor old Bert Hadley drove past this apparition in the middle of the track and almost dropped it because he said he'd seen a ghost.
And it's an indication of just the nature of racing drivers of his era. They were as probably famed for the stories that can never be printed of the hijinks that they got up to, you know, climbing statues in the middle of towns after Grand Prix weekends and the like.
Yeah.
Because
that's what you did.
They were all from an era, a generation that lived through the war, and for them life was to be lived. Life was devoutly to be lived, and boy, he lived life to the fullest with every breath he drew.
When we see the DBR1 Aston Martin, reminds us of the 1,000-kilometer race at the Nürburgring, where Stirling was paired with Jack Fairman. Jack was a reliable but not very quick driver, and Stirling knew that he would have to do the bulk of the work, but the law said the co-driver had to do some laps. So Stirling came in, Jack Fairman jumped in, and it was a wet and slippery track, and Jack sadly, unfortunately, went off backwards, but he was a big beefy guy, and he put his shoulder to the back of the car, heaved it back up the slope and onto the track and back to the pits, slightly bruised and battered, and Stirling ruthlessly hauled him out. There's a lovely photograph of Stirling hauling Jack Fairman out of the car, jumped in, and he was a long way off the lead, but blow me down, he drove gangbusters, and Aston Martin won that race and won that year's Sports Car Championship.
Yes, Stirling helped not just Aston Martin to World Sports Car Championship glory.
The Duke mentioned how many times the cops used to say, "Who do you think you are, Stirling?" Well, Stirling told me that he once was driving through the outback in Australia and came upon a little Australian village with a big sign outside saying, "Drive slowly unless you're Stirling Moss." So he took delight in putting his foot down and zooming through this little town. Excellent. Why is there a little Sprite there? Well, it deserves to be there because BMC in their wisdom entered the Sebring Sprite for the 4-hour, well, initially 3-hour, then the 4-hour race at Sebring that preceded the 12-hour race, and Stirling delighted in being a member of that team and had fun, and of course won the race against the might of the Italian Abarth cars.
And you can see just a little further back in the parade from the two Sprites, in fact, the Gold XK, which they used for that land speed record, or the 24-hour endurance record. And of course, if you go to the National Motor Museum at Gaydon, you'll see some of MG's record breakers. It wasn't just for Jaguar, he also was in some of the EX record breaking attempts and successful record breaking runs. So he could drive rally, he could drive continuity, he could drive anything.
As an example,
flat out, all day and all night.
People are wondering, saying, surely Stirling never raced a 300 SL Gullwing? Well, he didn't ever race one, but he and Dennis Jenkinson used a 300 SL to recce the Mille Miglia track until they came upon an Italian army truck that turned left into their path. Mercedes said, okay, we'll find another car. But he did compete in the 300 SL in the Tour de France 2 times. Didn't win it, but the 300 SL justifiably is here on the grid today.
Well, we're looking here at the Mercedes 722. That, of course, was the starting time, 7:22 in the morning. That was his time off the start ramp for the 1955 Mille Miglia. And he and Dennis Jenkinson won. Jenks using pace notes that they had meticulously made during reconnaissance laps of the race. and he rolled them out on this sort of toilet roll affair with a little perspex cover, a really sophisticated aid. And he was also responsible for keeping Stirling fueled up. Initially in practice, they were using oranges, and he'd peel an orange and feed Stirling segments when not clinging on or egging him on to go ever faster, because Dennis Jenkinson was not a man who was afraid of the speed in the passenger seat, although he probably should have been. And Stirling was complaining they were covered in grime and brake dust and oil and muck and dirt off the roads, and so they then reverted to bananas, which were hermetically sealed until Jenks peeled one and stuck it in Stirling's mouth to keep him going. But Jenks was using hand signals. There was no intercom. He was using hand signals to direct Stirling, you know, and a lot of the time, given Jenkinson's nature, it was just to egg him on to go faster and faster and faster.
We just caught a glimpse of Jim and Annie Stradwick in the back of the Rolls-Royce, and without Jim and Annie, Stirling wouldn't have lasted beyond 1962. They saved his life, but it's wonderful that they're here in this parade. In the middle of the screen, just disappearing off to the right, Simon Taylor in what we now call the Stoveboat Special, but actually started life as a 1.5-seater Grand Prix Alta with a Grand Prix HWM with an Alta engine. Then it went off to the States. It starred in a terrible film called, I can't remember what it called, but they chucked away the Alta engine and shoved in the Stoveboat little V8 Chevy engine, and Simon's had it for a long time, drives it on the road. Great to see Derek Bell in the little Porsche 550 Spider. Stirling loved that car. He said it was almost unbreakable, but also was sweet handling. For us Fraser-Nash fans, we've got a couple of Fraser-Nashes on the track, reminding us that Stirling raced Sid Green's Fraser-Nash in the British Empire Trophy in Northern Ireland, and of course won. And we caught a glimpse of the strange BMW Isetta. That was a pretty unsuccessful development of the little two-seater bubble car that was the four-seater Isetta 600, with which, there it is, with which Elliott passed his driving test. Stirling had that for a while. It then disappeared for year after year, and it was only discovered relatively recently, hiding in a garage somewhere, and Stirling got it back, and it was being nicely restored.
Yeah, it has been recently restored now in part of a private collection, and he hopped the engine up, because Stirling Moss would, from a 600 to a 700, so you know, in the way of Fiat Cinquecentos, don't stay with the smallest engine, go with the biggest you can get.
He raced an A-Type Connaught. There's David Wenman's yellow one. He loved the handling of it, he loved the brakes, but compared with the Cooper Bristols, it didn't have all that much power. A-Type Connaught. There's the Sunbeam Talbot, I think, which, as His Grace said, Stirling competed in the Monte Carlo Rally. Norman Garrett, who was competition manager of the Roots Group, offered Stirling and Peter Collins and Roy Salvadori 50 quid to compete in the 50 quid each to compete in the Monte Carlo Rally. They had nothing much on. They'd come back from the Tasman series down under, and they said, well, yeah, that'll be fun. A drive to the south of France for 50 quid, we'll go for that. But actually, Stirling, of course, took his rallying very seriously, and as the Duke said, he got 3 Coupe des Alpes, which was not an easy thing to get.
Sister Pat, a very successful rally driver in her own right as well. Ended up rallying big Heelys, which were nobody's idea of an easy job.
There's the little Elva Mark 7 in Rob Walker colours.
Yes, his association with Rob Walker was long and very successful. So I think the two of them sort of complemented each other beautifully. A very British team.
Give a special wave to Jim and Annie in the back of the Rolls-Royce. They definitely deserve to be there.
Absolutely right. And Chris, we talk about this a lot at a lot of race meetings. The men and women in orange and here in white suits who are marshalling, who look after the drivers, who take care of all the incidents and accidents, and who are responsible for everybody's safety. Unpaid volunteers, all of them, and without whom, well, there are drivers, and Stirling Moss was one of them, without whom we would not potentially see again. And anybody who has even the most minor accident at a race circuit has reason to be thankful for the marshals, just alone for the flag signals, never mind for any other medical or physical intervention that's required. So again, hats off to everybody who's come here. If you are interested in motorsport in any way, shape or form, and you want to get a little closer to the action, the British Marshals Clubs, if you look for them online, they would be very, very pleased to help you join their happy band of followers. And again, here at Goodwood at the Revival meeting, at every single competition meeting across the world, without volunteer marshals and corner workers to keep the competitors safe, motorsport would simply stop. So to all of you and to Jim and Annie today, particularly, a big vote of thanks.
We owe you a great debt. We caught a glimpse of the front-engine Grand Prix BRM, the P25 BRM. Stirling never was a member of the BRM Works team, but he borrowed the P25. It was painted in UDT Laystall, a pale green, and he didn't have much success. The most famous thing about that car is an amazing photograph of it having a terrible accident at Avus in Germany and spitting out its driver, who crouches watching it sailing over his head. There's, appropriate enough, there's George Cooper. We caught a glimpse of him in the little Cooper MG, a very early Cooper car, Cooper's first attempt at a little sports car, and that car's had a charmed life. It caught fire in a garage. George brilliantly, beautifully rebuilt it, and I suppose gave Stirling his first taste of two-seater sports car racing, because up to that time it was racing the single-seater Cooper, and as His Grace said, having great success following his entry in the 1948 Goodwood meeting, which of course he won. I didn't realize they had three-lap races in those days.
And to win a three-lap race by 30 seconds. Yes. Everybody else must have just thought, okay, do you know what, I'm giving this up now. There must be something else I can do that I'm not going to get thrashed so resoundingly at.
There's the lovely DBR1 Aston Martin, that the car that won the 1959 Le Mans, but that wasn't being driven by Stirling. But he did win the 1000 Ks at Nürburgring with Jack Fairman in a DBR1. I'm not sure if it was that one. And enabling Aston Martin to win the championship that year.
Yeah, Stirling never the most eager fan of Le Mans as a current race driver. He certainly liked going quickly. He quite enjoyed the cars a lot of the time, but really didn't. It didn't particularly suit his nature to have to nurse the car for 24 hours. Well, it's been a great tribute to Sir Stirling Moss on a picture-perfect day here at Goodwood. And if you are at the motor circuit, you can come and see all these cars up close in the infield all week.